Welcome to Cults and the Culting of America podcast. My name is Scott Lloyd. I am joined by knitting cult lady, Daniela Mestenek Young. Daniela, it's good to see you.
Good to see you too.
It's been a minute since we've had the opportunity to be on together, but I'm really thrilled and excited about tonight's episode because a longtime friend of mine, Dr. Scott Culpepper, is joining us. Scott, it's so good to see you.
Great to see you too, Scott. Good to be with you and Daniela.
Absolutely. And Scott Culpepper and I go way back here. We were doing podcasts before anyone was listening. And thanks to Daniela now, people are actually listening to what we have to say, Scott. So this is going to be a great show.
That's fantastic. Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation.
Yeah, so the last time we were together, you were a history professor at the same institution where I was a communications professor. I think that was the last time we were together in person. But just for my sake and for everyone listening, what have you been up to lately?
Yeah, I left Louisiana in 2012, and I've been in Northwest Iowa for almost 13 years now, which is so hard to believe. A lot of life happens in 13 years. I've been teaching history here at a small Christian university in Northwest Iowa. I get to teach like early modern European history, Renaissance, Reformation, class on witch trials, Latin American history, and then also get to teach religion and American culture. So it's great. I have the best of both worlds. I can do the Atlantic world European thing, and then I can still incorporate my training in religious studies and theology as well. So it's a lot of fun. It's been a great experience. I've got fantastic students. In the intervening years, I've started doing some research on the Satanic Panic, which is part of what we'll talk about today. Some of it stemming from my experiences in Louisiana and earlier in high school and all of that, and just sort of feeding into my academic studies. This last year, I published a fiction book in the fall, which stems from that research I'm doing for a nonfiction book that I'll publish down the road soon. So that's been my current research interest and work. And aside from that, grading papers, teaching great students, and trying to keep my head above water.
I love it. I love it.
Writing books is hard, so I definitely hope we get to hear more about your book. The Satanic Panic. This is a hard one for people because anytime you bring up that this was not real, people go straight to how could you not believe victims? Can you kind of like give us a little orientation to the Satanic Panic and what it was and how it ties into like religious studies?
Absolutely. It's so amazing how few people still know much about the Satanic Panic. There are times when I'm talking to people like you who've had some experience with it, and you think, well, surely everyone must know because we experienced it so deeply. But in so many ways, it's one of the biggest out of the open public things that so many people still don't know anything about. And my students in my classes are just completely unaware. I'll bring up the prohibitions against Dungeons and Dragons. Today, I teach on a Christian college campus. They play Dungeons and Dragons as part of the gaming guild there and think absolutely nothing of it. So they're shocked at the panic, the hysteria over the game in the 80s. Basically, it was this moment in American history and culture from roughly about the mid 1960s to about the mid 1990s when you had a confluence of cultural forces coming together, changes in mainstream culture, concerns about harmful practices and activities, and a lot of popular culture creations that focused on the occult that sort of coalesced together to create this societal panic where you had people not just in the places you would expect, places like conservative churches or denominations that were really into spiritual warfare theology, but outside of those circles as well, law enforcement, psychologists, social workers, people concerned that there were actual cult members throughout the country focused intently on damaging young people and seeking to corrupt the culture. It was amazing how far it branched out into the various circles of society, far beyond the areas where those things usually percolate. And to some degree, it's very much a phenomenon of the late 20th century, at least the particulars of it. But in other ways, it's also a tale as old as time. You go back to the witch trials of the early modern period,
Right.
and some of the same sorts of through lines are there. the same sorts of cultural tendencies. They seem like they recycle. I had a friend at one point that said that history doesn't necessarily repeat, but it does rhyme very often. And there is a rhythmic sense to a lot of this too. You get cycles of this kind of thing. And what was so interesting about the Satanic Panic in the late 20th century, we all assumed that we were so enlightened that such things could happen in that place, in that time. And of course, we discovered very quickly that that enchantment of the universe, of reality, hasn't gone away. It might go into hibernation sometimes, but people are still afraid of what goes bump in the night. They're still concerned that there are mystical powers out there. And one of the things that I've been really drawn to in my study of the Satanic Panic is the sense in which so much of it was like a proxy war, sort of a strategy of distraction in many ways, because you had people mobilized to fight these cultural enemies or perceived cultural enemies fueled by satanic power, they believed, while ignoring other very real societal issues that were going on right in front of them. But those were hard to deal with. They were complicated. They required deep thinking. It was much easier to mobilize against these perceived cultural threats.
And what's interesting about this, we lived through this, Scott, in such a profound way, because I remember it in the churches that I was involved with, the institutions of higher education. This was something that was accepted among so many people without an ounce of evidence. It was like, where is the evidence that all of this is taking place? And I laugh at the lunacy of it, but it had very real world implications, very profound implications, negative implications for a lot of people. I think about the story of the West Memphis Three, and that was a close proximity to where I grew up in Northeast Arkansas. And I remember back in the 90s, these three young men were, assumed to be guilty because they were a little bit out of the mainstream when it came to their practice of religion or the way that they behaved, the way that they acted. And so when these heinous murders took place, it was just assumed, well, this had to be a satanic cult. And these three young men, their lives were devastated for many, many years until they were recently released.
Yeah, it was horrific. And their story is so powerful. Damien Eccles tells that story often on podcast, and it is just moving and heartbreaking. And one of the things that was so crazy about that episode is it's the early 90s. There has been an office of the FBI, like you said, investigating this intensively, looking for the evidence that most people are not even caring to be concerned with. And they're reaching their conclusions by the early 90s that there's nothing there. The FBI is publishing a special report in 1993 and 94, which states, we have found no evidence of satanic cult activity, and yet the persistence of these myths, those three boys are being railroaded at just that time.
It has interesting echoes to me of kind of what's going on right now with this almost like, I call it fantasizing about the apocalypse or apocalypticizing, and you talked about this being like a proxy war. And I think, a lot of what fueled this into the 80s and 90s was people getting on the internet and people understanding like the depths to which children were being abused. People, we were learning about the Catholic Church, right? Like people are learning that the people in their families and their churches and their religions are the ones abusing the children. And they don't want to have that discussion. So they go on this imaginary warpath about satanic rituals. And, I've noticed this even on the left with liberals in the social justice arena, that so many of us have left religious extremism. But I don't think we've deconstructed the like rapture and the panic and the, I have people like asking me like, what are we going to do in the revolution? But they're not comfortable enough to have a conversation with their dad or their father-in-law or like the person in their life that is actually voting for this stuff that they think is ending the world.
Yeah, it's so true. Christianity Today has been doing a podcast called The Devil in the Deep Blue Sea. And I like the way they have structured that because they've compared the response to Damien Eccles and the West Memphis Three to the way that the church dealt with the revelations about the Duggars and the difference. Like these guys, the West Memphis Three, they weren't actually guilty of this crime, but they were not given the benefit of the doubt. The Duggars given the benefit of the doubt to the nth degree because they look like us. They sound like us. They fit the evangelical mold. But of course, those who don't fit the mold, they're suspect. They're problematic. They could be bearers of evil and darkness.
And that's what it's always been, right? The witch hunts have always been some form of you're not like us, right? Like you're a woman who is living on the edge of town, surviving on her own, like almost like showing the lie to, right? Like the cult tells you the small town is like, you have to live this way, right? You have to live this way under our rules if you want to be valid. And the people living on the fringes are showing kind of like the lie to these social rules and social norms. And I think in some ways we just can't tolerate that.
Absolutely. It can't turn out well for them, because if it turns out well for them, then maybe that's a critique of the way that we have been living. There's not that sense that there's room for acceptable differences, pluralism, acceptable pluralism for all of us, that we can all thrive and still pursue different paths. That's one way I feel like evangelical Christianity sometimes really shoots itself in the foot, because they work so hard in youth group context to make you afraid of the world and those in the world. And the portrayal they give you of those who are not committed to Christ is they're miserable people, they're awful people, they're immoral sort of people. And you leave that context and you actually encounter these people. Not only do you often discover that they're great people, they're often better people than the people that you've been encountering in youth group or in church circles. Their morality is sometimes deeper and purer and more consistent. And so creating those straw men, which the Satanic Panic, witch hunts, all the kind of moral panics throughout the history of the world do, is just destructive to Christianity in the end. It hurts the trust that people have in the church when they will give these inaccurate pictures of other people. And when people start to discover the reality, they'll start asking the question, well, if they were wrong about this, what else are they wrong about? And the abuse crisis is, of course, such a huge part of all of this, because a lot of the concerns, the hysteria that fed into the early years of the Satanic Panic involved concerns about satanic ritual abuse, rumors about abuse happening in daycares, most infamously in the McMartin preschool case beginning in 1983 and going on until the very early 90s. There were allegations that daycare workers were taking kids to secret tunnels below the daycare, engaging in satanic rituals, flying around the room, and just all kinds of things. You could look at the interviews that some social workers conducted with the kids at the daycare. You can follow the pattern of the interviews, and you could see where the interviewers are planting suggestions, which the kids are eventually going to take up, because just like previously in the witch trials, where they would question someone for days until finally they were like, okay, I'll say whatever you want me to say. Just stop this. Let me sleep. Let me eat. These kids are being questioned by these adults, and they decide, they're accustomed to asking, okay, what do I have to do to make these adults happy? And so eventually they'll start parroting back the suggestions the adults are making until these huge castles are built in the air.
Yeah.
There's a picture of the McMartin grounds where concerned parents showed up and dug up the grounds. It looks like Dig Dug, in the yard. They're like these trenches that parents have dug. It's an imagined space. There is no basement below the school. And a lot of people have talked about how maybe part of that was influenced by the feelings that people had as more kids were going to daycare, more women are joining the workforce. There are some anxieties about how their kids maybe are being cared for during the day. You've got books like Michelle Remembers coming out, where Michelle Smith, interviewed by her counselor, later husband, Lawrence Pasdar, says that she recalls memories of abuse, and it just begins to mushroom. And like you said, you get this visceral fear that there are menacing people out to harm our children, while there is an epidemic of abuse in both the Roman Catholic Church and evangelical churches. And like you said, as the statistics start to pile up, it becomes more evident that where abuse is happening, it's usually happening within families, perpetrated by someone who is known to the family, maybe even a family member.
Yeah.
And what's so, go ahead.
I want to say it's interesting, this programming of the fear. It makes me think of, so I'm an organizational psychologist, and so we study Adam Smith, hate that guy, um, who, originally theorizes that like 80% of humanity is shiftless and awful and will just try to get away with everything, right? And 20% are the ones that want the world to like function and be in place and work. And like he should have just stayed to finances, right? Because obviously, turns out it's actually the opposite. And now we have empirical science and we know that like 80% of society wants the world to work nicely. And it's interesting, in security policy now, you're setting your policies for those 20% of people, right? You're slowing down the 80% to catch the 20% that are actually doing the thing. And I kind of feel like when you were talking, I was just thinking of that. And like when you get out of a cult, or when you get out of these cult of churchianity, I call it, that has inculcated this fear into you and told you like the whole world is bad. And it's almost like flipping that percentage, right? It's like, yes, there are bad people out there that are going to do horrible things to you, but the majority of people you're going to meet are going to be nice and accepting. And like, it's not what we've been told or taught to think.
Absolutely. There's so many people who've gone through the process that some people call deconstruction, where they first of all had to learn to trust the world and not be afraid of the unknown out there. And then having gone through that process, they have to relearn, if they're inclined to, how to trust the church again, because some of the paradigms they were given were inaccurate. They were distracting or even fear producing. And they have to go back and decide, how do I be critical again and be a person of faith and combine those things? And that's no easy thing. That's a big part of what the fiction book that I wrote deals with, is the idea of these girls who are raised in an environment like that on steroids, like a supercharged, ever-present spiritual warfare environment. And what would you carry forward into adulthood? What kind of scars would you wrestle with throughout your life? What would you do if you had to go back and confront it? Those are the kind of things I really enjoy dealing with in writing that.
Scott, it strikes me that you and I were raised in an environment in church cultures where Satan was a convenient foe. He was a frequent foil, if you will, especially if there was something that was going on in the church, or something in the leadership's life that needed a convenient distraction, right? Like, don't look at all the bad things that are happening over here. Look at what Satan is attempting to do in the world. And we'd all get, excited and caught up with that. I want you to talk a little bit about the history of this, even going back. You mentioned the witch trials and things of that nature. But before you do, Daniela, I'm curious, in the children of God, what did the role of Satan look like? Was he something that you guys heard about often? What did that look like in your context?
Yes, I mean, the children of God was sort of pretending to be Christian, right? Or based in Christian theology. So we had Satan, but I would say much, much more, we had the United States. The United States was who he had decided was our bad guy. And so it was,
Wow.
America, Babylon, the whore. And turns out, as I would go to figure out as an adult, like a big part of that was to get his people living abroad, because it's much harder to leave your cult when you're also being geographically abused and you're in other parts of the world. So yeah, like we definitely had Satan, and being used for whatever, and everything was the devil, especially if you had any sort of feelings, right? It was the devil. But the sort of like big bad guy out there that was going to get us, that was going to end the world, was always the United States.
Uncle Sam.
Wow. That's interesting. Well, Scott, going back throughout history, has this sort of satanic panic, it showed up frequently in our history as a nation, I would think.
It has. And not only that, but different manifestations of similar things as well. If you look at the medieval period, for a long time, you had folk magic sort of coexisting with a robust Christian theology. And part of the reason for that's because as they converted Germanic tribes after the fall of the Roman Empire, they had a lot of those folk practices. And sometimes the church challenged those, but sometimes they just sort of let them be. They felt like it was more negative, more problematic to challenge those and just to let them grow. And you kind of got to change towards the end of the medieval period, 15th century or so. There begins to be an attachment with folk practices with sort of a theology of demonism and ideas about Satan making pacts with people. And at that point, you really get the heyday of witch hunting from the late 15th century until about the early 1800s or so. In the U.S., of course, we saw witch hunts in Connecticut. The first person hung for witchcraft, Alice Young, in the U.S., was hung in 1647. The Salem trials happened about 30 years later, 1692. And you don't see a lot of overt witch hunting in the 19th century in the U.S., but you see other things like anti-Catholicism. There's a huge movement to try to oppose Catholicism, both because it was seen as an immigrant faith and also because of rumors of things that were going on in convents. You had anti-Masonry. Parties like the Know Nothing Party in American politics was very intent on trying to remove the influence of Masons. And so you do have a number of different panics. You have the Red Scare in the early 20th century, and then you have the second manifestation of that in the 1950s with McCarthyism. And that really prompted a lot of people, like, for instance, Arthur Miller with The Crucible, to connect the history of witch hunts with some of these more contemporary cultural witch hunts that were going on. And so you had films like plays and films like The Crucible and Inherit the Wind, which dealt with prosecution of John Scopes and anti-evolution. That all comes to bear about the early 1960s, which is right on the eve of the explosion of the Satanic Panic. So there is kind of an awareness in American culture these things could go very badly. And of course, they will again in the late 60s.
And what's interesting is growing up in my Pentecostal context, this was always coupled. The fear of Satan was always coupled with the end time dispensational theology that
Yes.
we were given. You know, like any day now, Jesus is coming back. It could be any moment, any time, and if you're left behind, sucks to be you. It's really going to be bad. And I remember it must have been the late 70s, but it was around the time that The Omen, that movie about the Antichrist, made its network television debut. Because I remember distinctly, I was a kid and my dad didn't go to church with us, and so every once in a while I would stay home with my dad. And on this particular Sunday night, I stayed home. And of course, The Omen was the movie of the week. And I was convinced that God was sending me a warning for skipping church. I mean, I was scared out of my mind.
David's going to get you.
Absolutely. And for those of us that grew up in that time period, if you were adjacent to or steeped in evangelical Christianity in the United States, that was a real fear that hung over our heads.
Oh, absolutely. And it's amazing in this story how fiction and artistry combines with those existential fears and theology to help create all this. Because if you think about the late 60s, Rosemary's Baby comes out.
Mm-hmm.
Just a couple of years after that, Sharon Tate is killed by the Manson family. Roman Polanski, her husband, had been the director on that film. And then in 73, The Exorcist comes out. It's fascinating to study exorcism belief and rituals in America before and after The Exorcist. There's a scholar named Joseph Laycock who just published a book called The Exorcist Effect, where they track the change in both the number of people who believe in demonic possession and the rituals they believe deal with demonic possession. And it's fascinating to see how ritual practice and the policy of different denominations conforms to the fiction that is peddled to us in The Exorcist. So those are often called the unholy trinity: Rosemary's Baby, The Exorcist, and The Omen. And of course, early 70s, you had Hal Lindsey, who is propagating that dispensational theology. He also publishes a book called Satan is Alive and Well on Planet Earth, where he completely leans into the idea that satanic cults are operating in the shadows and we need to be prepared. He also dismisses every aspect of Western philosophy since like Plato. He's got a section of that book where he critiques every philosopher. He's like, oh, they're all just influenced by the devil. And at that same time, in 1972, Mike Warnke, Christian comedian, comes out claiming to have been a former satanic high priest. And so all of these films are in the zeitgeist. Dispensational belief about the end times is growing because of the reestablishment of Israel in the late 1940s. People are latching on to that and using that as a prominent sign in their interpretation of biblical prophecy. And so it really is just set to ignite all of this in the 70s and 80s. Hal Lindsey never actually set dates, but he came so dangerously close so many times that at one point had one prophecy enthusiast tell me, well, Jesus says we can't know the day or the hour. We didn't say anything about the decade or the century. I said, well, I think it was kind of implied. So, yeah, you have all of those energies brimming, all of those cultural forces brimming. I used to joke that Christians can't make good action movies unless they're set during the tribulation. TBN released like several action movies where, Christians are all following the way of Christ until the rapture happens. And then all bets are off. Everybody who's left has got to survive the tribulation. So even if you're converted to Christianity, you're still going to be an action hero.
That's so interesting.
It makes me wonder how much of it does come from like not needing religion anymore because there are fewer crises. I don't know how true this is, and you would know, but I have been told that like the Catholic Church originally was like, you don't go to heaven unless you're baptized. And then like they had to give people babies, right? Because like people weren't going to go along with it. So many kids died in infancy that they had to like be like, okay. And if you think about it, right, like 60s, 70s in America, like life is becoming pretty good for the average, like white evangelicals. You're not having a lot of your children dying, wars, famines, right? Like these big kinds of crises until obviously Vietnam. And you need a villain, right? Like you in your hero story, you must have a villain to vanquish. And this is even true with military planning. Like, I noticed, like, the difference between briefing pilots when there was no enemy out there where we were going to do the exercise versus when there were people playing enemy, like American soldiers dressed up that were going to point their laser guns at your helmet and go bang, bang, you're out. All of a sudden, they pay attention. They're focused. Right. And like the reality of what's going to happen hasn't changed. Like the enemy's not anymore real, but they care.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point, especially given the fact that, like you said, there is so much post-war prosperity. The kids of the 50s and the early 60s, if they're white kids, if they're white suburban kids living in a certain cultural context, they've got it pretty good. And when you get to the late 60s, these kids who have been so privileged, a lot of them getting to go to college for the first time, they're first generation college students, they're frustrated with Vietnam. They're frustrated with racism. They're frustrated with the way that women have been treated in American society. They're embracing all these causes. They're disaffected because of changes that have needed to be made for so long. And there's a sense of confusion on the part of their elders. A lot of them are resentful of that and saying, what's your problem? We gave you such a privileged upbringing, and now so many of you seem to be turning against that. What is the issue? And instead of trying to really drill down and understand what are the cultural concerns, the social justice issues that are motivating these people, that are creating the counterculture, that are causing people to sort of drop out of American society, or at least to challenge its darker side, instead of drilling down into that, like you said, they're looking for the enemy. And as Dana Carvey would say, as the church lady, it's Satan. It becomes Satan. He's part of the problem. This is a satanic force that is taking over our kids. They don't appreciate the wonderful American culture that we've handed to them. They're trying to tear down the foundations of the country. Not only will we get mobilized in regard to spiritual warfare, but we're going to the ballot box as well. We're going to create political action organizations. We're going to take this country back.
Yep. And it's, we've seen that in the political messaging more and more and more, I think, coming into modern times of like, this is the fight for the soul of the nation. But it occurred to me when you were talking that like, this is a lot of first generation college students have this problem where it's like your parents and your elders like sacrificed so that you could go to college. But then you come home with a college education and then they get mad that you're using your education to question things, to say, hey, maybe it doesn't need to be this way,
I'm 51 years old with a history degree, been teaching for about 18 years. My parents still don't understand what I do as much as I try to explain it. And when I'll write like critical essays, like for instance, a while back, I wrote a critical essay about Carmen and Petra. Scott's done some great stuff on Carmen as well, and contemporary Christian music. And my mom would read that. She'd be like, "Well, I thought you liked those people." And I'm like, well, I've kind of grown in my preferences, so I've kind of grown beyond them in some ways. On the other hand, I can appreciate the role they had in my spiritual formation. But for me to be critical is not me attacking them. It's me being analytical. But even that idea of academic detachment and that you can have at least some kind thoughts towards something while having a healthy detachment from it and a critical perspective on it, that's so hard for them to grasp. I mean, even that simple aspect, that very basic aspect of college life is something that people who haven't experienced it seem to have such a hard time grasping. And then you get a political figure like a J.D. Vance who says then professors are the enemy. And they just take that at face value instead of understanding the richness that brings to our culture.
And what's interesting about that, Scott, is I've had similar experiences. All of us that have pursued education outside of the church, outside of what church dictates as acceptable education, invariably you get those kinds of pushbacks and criticisms, in part, I think, because what education does, I think the best thing that education does, especially a liberal arts education, is it gives you the opportunity to escape the binary, right? The matrix that says it's either or, this or that. And if we're talking in the context of satanic panic, that plays right into the binary, right? People want to believe that there are simple solutions to these complex, nuanced problems that have taken centuries to create. They want to reduce it to a very easy to understand and solvable problem, which when you put Satan in the mix, right, and you start blaming him for all of the ills of the world, it's the same way that we were taught to believe about the rapture, right? We didn't have to be too concerned with the problems of this world because we were planning on leaving the world. We were escaping from the world. So that relieves us of any responsibility for the environment, for the economy, for racism, for the patriarchy, for whatever. We have nothing to do with that because we're not of this world and we're escaping this world.
It's interesting when you mentioned that. I thought about some of the recent beliefs about relocating to Mars. This planet is finished, and that's a secular version of the same kind of mentality that you're just going to junk the world.
Yes, and I've been saying this for a decade, that the civilian version of, oh, the robots are coming, or like panic over AI, right? It all has this tone of like, hey, the apocalypse is coming, right? Like if you're a CEO and you think robots are just going to replace everyone's job, then you don't actually have to like prepare your people to deal with the changes that are coming.
Yeah.
But really this people want a trick, right? People want an easy answer. I've been using knitting as my analogy recently because people will say to me, they're like, oh my gosh, you knit so well, right? Like, how do your hands not get sore, right? And they want me to give them some tricks, some gloves, some supplements, something. And the answer is just, and I've been waiting to turn 38 for years so I could say this, I've been knitting as long as Jesus was alive. Like, that's the answer, right? Like, I have built this up for 33 years, and that's why I can knit for 12 hours a day. And so it's like,
Absolutely.
and that's everything in this world. Like nobody masters anything without spending years in it, right? This is, I think, the difference between experts and gurus, right? Experts can tell you exactly where all their information came from and all of the education they went on to get that information, whereas a guru is like, I was visited by spirits and now I can heal you.
That was one of the most heartbreaking things about some of this for me. I served as a youth minister for the 4 years that I went to college in Louisiana. And it was at a Baptist church, but of course, Central Louisiana is very revivalist. It has a very powerful, charismatic movement. Pentecostals of Alexandria are a huge, influential church. And so you have a lot of Holy Spirit theology and a lot of deep spiritual warfare theology. And there was a kid in my youth group whose mom had gotten divorced because her husband cheated on her. And she's raising 2 teenage kids, and she's dealing with the fallout from that, and obviously struggling with depression and with other things as well. And there was a local deliverance ministry person who's actually a medical doctor and a pretty respected member of the community that had gathered a small group, and they engaged in deliverance sessions. And as a youth minister, as a 19-year-old college kid, I kind of interacted with this group and heard a lot of their theology and actually witnessed them doing deliverance work with various people. And it was heartbreaking. And for a little bit, I was very curious and I wondered, is this something that I should be involved in myself? Is this something that could enhance my ministry? The more I saw of it, the more disheartening it was, because they would take people like my friend who were dealing with depression, or someone who was dealing with alcoholism, someone who was dealing with addiction to pornography. And Satan is the enemy. They would identify a demonic spirit that was the enemy. And their theology was, you can't be possessed by Satan, which most Christians would agree with. If you're a Christian, you can't be possessed, but you could be oppressed by a spirit, meaning that spirit would energize the natural inclinations of your flesh and make it that much more overpowering. And so they would sit the person down and they would go through this ritual where they would pray with the person and they would identify what the problem was. Was it the demon of lust? Is it the demon of depression? At one point, they identified Mammon, the demon of money, which is unusual because they usually didn't have a problem with people having issues with greed, but they did from time to time. And then they would exorcise that spirit. And they would tell the person, okay, that tie has been broken. And so now you're free of that. You're free to grow beyond that. And I mean, of course, like you said, it's daily. It's not something you can deal with in a night. If you're dealing with alcoholism or if you're dealing with any of those things, it's a daily struggle. And something you have to pick up and continuously do. And so inevitably those people would relapse. And the guy that was in my youth group, his mom just struggled desperately. It was up and down like a yo-yo. And she really needed very good counseling, and she got a little bit of that. But most of her energy was put into these deliverance meetings, and she would have them done over and over again. And it was very heartbreaking. I mean, in some ways, maybe there was some spiritual support and help and all that. But ultimately, just like we are talking about before, it is kind of a distraction. It's diverting them from other resources that could help them better. And fortunately, I got to a point, I was just 19 years old, but I started to sense, this is problematic because of that. It's offering people an easy solution, a quick placebo that ultimately is not going to give them the release that they're seeking.
Yeah. I've even noticed this with myself where, like, I think I have the kind of, I know I have the kind of anxiety where if my family's not home when they said they're going to be home, I just know that they're dead on the side of the road somewhere, right? Like every single time. And I think, like, the more I've been healing and learning and understanding, and I think, like, part of it is such a weird thing of, like, working to be happy in a complicated life after trauma is hard work that you do every day.
Absolutely.
And if something were to just shatter your life, you wouldn't be expected to do that anymore, right? And I think there's this, it sounds so crazy to talk about, and we've talked about it a few times on this podcast as I'm like figuring this out and being like, I think that's my apocalyptic holdover, is like, oh well, if the worst happened, then I could just let go and fall apart. And it's something that I'm like really trying to kind of like investigate in my life right now.
It's a difficult task to sort of process what aspects of your belief system, what aspects of your faith are based on faith, and what aspects are based on fear. Because we use that fear as an early motivating response for kids. I mean, we tell them you're going to burn your hand or you're going to step out the street and get run over. And that's good advice. I mean, those are real problems to be afraid of. But over the years, we continue that mechanism as a tool to warn people about things we think are going to be destructive. And a part of my going back and looking at my formation and figuring out what's valuable that I need to hang on to and what's not and needs to be discarded kind of involves asking that question. Which of my beliefs or my inclinations are more based on faith or rationality, and which ones are based on fear, that sort of fear response, which is so much a part of the things we're talking about.
Yeah.
Scott, I think it's brilliant that you took your work and you put it into a fictionized account, because I think that, so much of what we do in the public sphere, I know that Danielle is much better at this than I am, but I tend to be, and you know this, Scott, that sometimes I tend to be like in your face, and I feel like sometimes I'm taking a rhetorical baseball bat to people's heads when I could be a lot more persuasive. And I think fiction is the way to do that, right? Because there's something about reading fiction that sort of people bring down their walls, so to speak, and they're more apt to listen to a fictionalized account than perhaps if. And I know you're working on a nonfiction book, but it's my guess that probably a lot of people would be more open to receive the fictionalized account than maybe what you're doing in the nonfiction world. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I've published nonfiction since 2011. That's when I published my dissertation, and off and on, I've published different things over the years. This fiction book came out in the fall, and several of my friends from high school said, "Wow, you're a published author." And I just sort of took that and celebrated that. I didn't point out the fact, well, I've been publishing these nonfiction things for years because, like you said, that's what people read. That sort of thing engages people at a different level. I love to write fiction anyway, and it's very therapeutic. So that's probably the main foundational reason I do it. But then after that, third is the idea of the broader reach that it has and the way that it can sort of penetrate people's natural defenses, get them engaged in the story and get them thinking about things they might not have entertained before. I love J.R.R. Tolkien's quote where he said, fiction can be an escape to reality, which is
And
just great. I mean,
I heard a quote recently from a historian, which was, we read nonfiction for knowledge, we read fiction for wisdom.
Oh, wow. Like, that's great. Oh, yeah. That is really great. Yeah, I mean, this was a great opportunity to be able to bring people into that world, many of whom had never experienced it. People here in Northwest Iowa, when I talked about the concept of the book, they had a hard time understanding it because they are only just now really getting pulled into evangelical culture. They've sort of had their own thing going on for a while. And since they've read the book, they will say, do these kind of things actually happen? And I said, yeah, there are cultures that are really invested in these things. Basically, the story I'm telling in this book, which is called The Demonologist's Daughters, is sort of a takeoff of the real life work of Ed and Lorraine Warren, who are the couple that are the basis of the Conjuring series of films, except rather than basing it on kind of the fantasy version in the Conjuring films, it's based on the actual family. They were very involved in paranormal investigations in the 1970s and 80s, and starting in 2011, 2012, they started making these films based on the records of their, quote, cases that Lorraine Warren, the wife, had created. She had written these different books over the years. But basically, their shtick was if there was any kind of paranormal event that was a manifestation of demonic activity, And so they would rush in, whether it was the Amityville horror or, something like the Enfield poltergeist haunting or whatever. They would come in, they would do their paranormal investigation, and they would perform an exorcism of some point. They have a daughter named Judy. And Judy and her husband, Tony Sparrow, so far have been very content to try to keep the legacy of her parents going. And it's a pretty lucrative legacy now with the films and all of that and the attention that's been newly drawn to them. So since her mother has died, they've been very focused on that. I was looking at their story as part of my nonfiction research and was kind of looking for my next fiction topic because I had written some fiction things before. And I just sort of started asking myself this question. Okay, Judy Warren seems very comfortable with her parents' legacy. What would happen if you had more than one daughter? And most of those daughters were not happy with the family legacy. They were trying to escape it, and they did successfully. But then something happens that brings them all back. What kind of scars would you carry? What would you have to deal with in returning to that environment? Just like Daniela was saying earlier, what kind of existential fears would you carry throughout your life because of the way that you had been raised? And so I kind of got this idea, The Conjuring meets Little Women, the story of four daughters that are enmeshed in this spiritual warfare culture. I won't spoil a whole lot, but two of them escape it. One stays. It's not a big spoiler to say one of them dies early on, and that's part of the mystery at the heart of the story. And so it's basically about bringing them back. And the way I tell the story is in a series of quartets where you have two chapters set in the present, and then a third chapter set 27 years before in 1995, where you see them as kids and you get to actually experience the world that they grew up in and understand the difficulties they faced. And then the fourth chapter in each quartet is taken from one of their mom's books, which has been used to promote the parents' ministry. And you basically get her version of the flashback chapter in chapter 3. And so you get to see how she has tweaked it, both to popularize their ministry and also to kind of deal with the painful realities there. She has really changed the story in various ways so that she can both comfort herself and she could portray it as nobler than it actually was.
And I'll just say the book is fantastic. I haven't finished it yet, but it is in my Kindle, and I'm working my way through it, Scott. And in fact, as soon as you announced it, I like to believe that I was among the first to have purchased it. But I have yet to finish it, so I'll get there.
Well,
I appreciate you diving in.
I mean, I'm very intrigued. I'm definitely going to read it. I'm putting together my book club list too for the upcoming year. So maybe I need to look at that because, one of the things that I've been saying recently is that, so cult experts have said many times that all cults are the same, right? Like coercive control is kind of the same. It doesn't really matter what flavor it is. And one of the things I think that I am doing is like helping to create the language for the cult baby experience, right?
Oh,
like
yeah.
things like you're in this world, but you're not of this world. Things like having your childhood sacrificed for a mission, and just like these things that it doesn't matter whether you were in Scientology, a Mormon, UPCI, recognized cult like me or any of these, like we have these shared experiences from the perspective of the children being brought along into these beliefs that become like so big and take over their world.
So true. Yeah. One of the themes in the book involves the parents going away to these exorcism sessions, deliverance sessions for like days and days on end. They don't know when they're going to come back. And the oldest daughter at the age of 12 ends up having to take care of all the rest. And that sort of becomes their life with their parents being very absent. And every time something comes up that the parents can't do for the kids because of that, the mom's phrase over and over again is, you've got to be good little soldiers for Jesus. You're part of the Lord's army. And so, it's like a military campaign and you've got to take the hardships of the sacrifices.
Scott, in your estimation, we've talked a little bit about education and beyond that, or maybe that is the answer, right? For folks that like me, who grew up in this kind of culture and context, sort of being able to take a step back from that and seeing it for what it is. Because I think of, you mentioned The Conjuring, and I've already seen that, Mark Driscoll, mega church pastor, is out there talking about all of these movies and saying, that society is fascinated with Satan and the work of Satan, and, beating this drum of satanic panic again, because, it's for a different reason than what you mentioned earlier. But I mean, it's lucrative, right?
Absolutely.
Gets butts in the seats, and it gets money in the offering plate. So how do we teach people? How do we lead people? How do we engage with folks to escape that kind of regressive thinking, right? Where you take all of the world's problems and you say, well, it's Satan's fault.
Yeah, and that is the $1,000,000 question today, not just in this realm, but across the board right now, dealing with misinformation. It is so challenging. One of the interesting things about looking at the late 80s and the beginning of the crumbling of a lot of this, a lot of the challenges to claims like Mike Warnke's, there was Lauren Stratford, who was claiming to be survivor of satanic ritual abuse. They came from within the church, from within evangelicalism. You had some people who were relatively conservative on the spectrum who were challenging these things and saying they don't give the church a good look. And at least in evangelical quarters, that was sort of the beginning of the end, but it was a long, painful process. It helps to have insiders to do that. I think about those people. I think about John Winthrop Jr. in Connecticut, the son of the more famous John Winthrop. He really helped to break the back of the witch trials there in the 1650s and 1660s, because he just, even though he was a very devout believer, he had a lot of questions about the default assumptions regarding witchcraft trials. And so he challenged that and began to bring an end to it. It helps to have people who can be seen as an authority figure or someone they respect to engage with those cultures. Problem we've got right now is that we are so polarized that almost anyone who presents a contrary opinion is labeled as a minion of Satan. It's almost hard to be an insider. Can anyone truly be? It almost reminds me of studying the French Revolution. And you've got someone like Robespierre, who says he's the incorruptible, saying, I define who is a true son or daughter of the revolution. And that is somewhat what we have here in American society today, where it's helpful for people within the various traditions to engage with these ideas and to be as tireless as they can be. It is exhausting to continue pushing back against what seems like absolute intransigence, telling these stories, recounting the history, continuing to engage in the kind of spaces that we were talking about earlier, which is often very difficult, especially when you've had painful experiences with them in the past. But being on social media, talking to your neighbors, like Daniela mentioned earlier, having that hard conversation with your parents, which you may have to have a few of those and then back off for a little bit, or with other family members. It's that tension, preserving the relationship, but at the same time being honest and truthful. I talk to so many people that speak of their family experiences right now, and they say our relationship is so shallow because the most important values we have, the most important things in our lives, we can't talk about without getting into a fight. But just continuing to share those things persistently and graciously, speaking the truth in love, sharing facts, sharing reality in as gracious of a way as we can manage, while still being forceful enough to not get run over, forceful enough to be willing to take it to those who seem to have no problem distorting reality.
And I've watched this phenomenon even with Daniela, right? So Daniela, I can't see. I don't. You did have blue hair at one point.
Still
okay.
fading.
All right. So blue-haired knitting cult lady Daniela is getting flack from the left, right? From people on the left. And I watched this phenomenon with her, and you're right. The polarization puts people that are willing to tell the truth, case in point with Daniela, at odds with who you would think would be her fiercest allies, right? And Daniela, you can talk to that experience a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I will even say with being a woman veteran, like I was presented with this very binary choice when I was like, I want to start telling my stories. And people were like, okay, so which one are you? Are you disgruntled or are you a proud veteran? And I had to go on this whole journey myself to eventually come back and be like, it's all of them, right? Like, it's my story of being one of the first women to go out on these combat teams is as important as the fact that I was pulled aside and told to watch my back against these same American soldiers, right? Like, we can hold nuance. We can have non-complicated stories. When I first started saying I was going to talk about the cult and the army, people would say, oh, well, the cult, like that's obviously evil, right? Which I still didn't agree with. Nothing's ever obviously evil in the place where it comes from. And then, but I was in this very like pro-veteran community. And then people would say, oh, but the US Army, that's a wonderful organization. And I finally started stopping and being like, let's, hold on, right? The US Army is 1.3 million humans trained to kill people as efficiently as possible. We work hard in the modern army to be as professional and as humane and as leadership sort of focused as we can. But neither of these organizations are either obviously good and obviously bad. And this is actually, I wrote a whole book. I've done like a 5-year project on this because people try to put me in these boxes. And the book that I just finished last week that comes out January 20th, I am showing like, here's my 10 things that make you a cult, right? And I'm going to show them to you in the most serious cults. And then also, here they are in our military and here they are in our regular organizations.
Wow.
And then, I think the thing that really unsettles people about me is then I just don't comfort you after that. Like, yeah, the military is a cult. We've just chosen to have 1% of our population in a cult because we say we need it. And we don't really want to like investigate that any further. So we just stop there. And actually just telling people like, no, look, this thing that this cult does, this tactic, here it is here, and just letting them see that. And I don't, we're not going to answer it. We're never going to get a definition of cult that everyone agrees on, just like we're never going to get a definition of good and bad. And quite frankly, the world doesn't come like that. So people will say to me all the time, they'll be like, well, I don't agree with everything you said, but I like this thing. And I'm always like, if you agreed with everything I said, I would be a little concerned for you. Like, that would be a little bit culty. I don't even agree with everything that I say. Like, I have to come back and call myself out on stuff.
Well, it's so true. I mean, those patterns of thought shaping, sometimes thought control, I mean, they're so similar across groups. I mean, there's so many groups that would fit into that sort of cultic definition. One of the interesting ironies to me about evangelical Christianity is the degree to which they want you to take it seriously, but not necessarily too seriously. One guy who was on Twitter at one point was responding to people who said, okay, you need to support Trump if you're a Christian. And this guy responded and said, okay, let me get this straight. So you taught me not to drink, not to smoke, not to have sex before marriage, and to be an absolute outcast in high school. And now you think I'm about to bow to peer pressure. It was that irony that, I mean, questioning these things, questioning this corruption, questioning this brutality and cruelty, that's who you taught me to be. And so many people are looking at their parents and saying, this person that you're supporting is the exact opposite of everything you ever taught me to be. And it's amazing how the culture still blows back against that and says, no, you're not one of us. And the response often is, well, in a very fundamental way, I'm more you than you are because I haven't abandoned these principles.
I'm writing a musical, and I'm putting this line in the musical that just says, aren't we the fruits that you've been raising up so well? You know, and we've kind of had this conversation a little bit as children of God survivors. Like, we grew up in such isolation that everything about me was made by the children of God, you know, and this is kind of, again, the funny part about these kind of cults or these closed thinking. It's like, you know, they told me to go fight the system, and that's what I'm doing. Like, they told me to, you know, that to like not take things that were being presented by the world, and yet they're upset when you then turn around and see like, hey, what about this definition? But yeah, it's even been so interesting to me how like people want to force me to be a leader and to give them guidance, and they're very uncomfortable with me just being like, nope, here's the facts, you know, like right now I'm the only cult expert that I know of that has military experience, and I'm just going to line these two up and leave them here for you. And, you know, I'm just going to talk about the history of blondness and white supremacy. And then people come back and be like, oh, so is it not okay? And I'm like, no, I'm not your morality police. I'm not your leader. I'm not your pastor. Like, there's no simple answer. Think about these things.
I just got to teach you my spring semester course on contemporary world civilizations, and always enjoy pointing out the fact that the major proponent in Germany of the 1930s and 1940s of blonde-haired, blue-eyed, Aryan German supremacy was a short, stumpy, black-haired Austrian who's proclaiming this. And I mean, just to go back to the amazing dynamics of cultic belief, people are buying that as the short, stumpy, unappealing guy who looks nothing like the ideal he's selling is convincing people this is the human ideal. It's just amazing.
Kind of sounds like Trump calling Taylor Swift unattractive.
Or questioning the musical ability of Bruce Springsteen. Seriously?
All right. Best thing I heard recently was like Taylor Swift and Bruce Springsteen need to throw a free concert in DC on the day of the parade. I was like, oh.
That would be great. Hey, Scott, thanks so much for being here. If folks want to buy your book, which I encourage, if they want to follow up with you, if they'd like to get you to come speak to their group or their organization, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
My website is kscottculpepper.com. And that's got links to all those things, like purchase links for the book. It's got a link to my newsletter, and it's also got links for speaking engagements. And I would love to come share with people. The book is available through Amazon, through Barnes and Noble, and pretty much any online outlet. It's available through Lightning Spark, which services all the online bookstores and all of that. So you can get it through any of those outlets. And in 2 weeks, you will be able to get it through Audible, iTunes, and Amazon Music in audiobook format.
Yeah, and tell us about you had an actress that is involved with this project, right?
Yes, she's an audiobook producer from Georgia. Her name is Haley Henderson. She is magnificent. I just did an interview with her earlier today to create some videos we could release on the eve of the actual release date. Oh, it was great. She was fantastic. She just infused it with so much emotion. And she's got a background in sort of studying art and theology. So she got the character, she got the story, she could do the nuances of academic conversation that came up every once in a while. It was great. So I'm really excited about that coming out.
Well, congratulations, Scott, and much success to all of your endeavors. I'm proud of you, my friend, and thrilled that we had the opportunity to reconnect on this episode.
Thank you so much, Scott. Appreciate you both and the important work that you're doing.
Thanks so much for sharing your wisdom with us.
Thank you.
Until next time, I'm Scott Lloyd for Daniela Mestenek Young, and we'll see you on the next episode of Cults and the Culting of America.